Lily got the call when she was shopping at Target. It was her son, Doug. "I'm okay, Mom," he said, "but the house is burning." Doug had mowed the lawn and put the lawnmower in the garage and shut it, and somehow it had ignited and set the whole house ablaze. By the time the fire trucks arrived, the house was consumed. They lost almost everything in it, but fortunately, all of the people were okay. A few weeks later, I sat down with Lily to discuss how she was doing. She said, "I never thought this could happen to me. I had been a part of other people's recovery when they had had house fires, but it never once occurred to me that I might be the person who was staying in the hotel and receiving other people's secondhand furniture and clothes." The unthinkable in that moment had happened to Lily. And frankly, if you live long enough, all of us experience something that previously had been to us unthinkable. The pink slip at work, the loss of a parent or a dear friend, a dangerous diagnosis. Our whole world went through the unthinkable with the pandemic and the following lockdown. And every season, it seems that there are towns and communities and lives that are completely upended and devastated by natural disasters. In each of these cases, what people used to take for granted is suddenly snatched away. Sometimes it's sudden, and sometimes you can see it coming. But when the unthinkable happens, you are never prepared. In our gospel lesson today, Jesus tries to make ready his disciples for their unthinkable. They were standing outside the temple in Jerusalem, the center of their faith, the most important place for their culture, their religion, their whole way of life. The temple was where God's presence was said to dwell. And it had stood for centuries, since King Solomon's day, and it was made with fine materials. Marveling at the construction, one of the disciples said, "What large stones and what large buildings!" But Jesus quashed his amazement. "You see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left upon another. All will be thrown down," Jesus said. It was a shocking thing to say, unimaginable. How could God's place of presence be destroyed? But that is what ended up happening. Some 30 years after Jesus' death, Jews who had been resistant to Roman rule rose up in a successful revolt, and they kicked the Romans out of Jerusalem. This inspired a terrible repression and brutal retaliation. During the Passover of 70 AD, Roman General Titus laid siege to Jerusalem. He surrounded the city, effectively trapping all of the pilgrims, the Jews who had come from all over the known world to celebrate the Passover in that city. And he gradually starved them for 4 months. And at the conclusion of that siege, he breached the walls of the city and murdered everyone inside. And he destroyed the temple, the symbol of all that was important to them. By the time Mark wrote this gospel, these events had taken place. And so, for the first hearers of this gospel, Jesus' words are not so much a prediction as they are a description of what they had already experienced. It was a description of their unthinkable. As they huddled in catacombs, listening to the stories about Jesus, they processed the war and division and famine they had already gone through. But hearing Jesus say these words to his disciples, words that reflected their own experience, it put their circumstances into a different light. It made them seem less random. Mark's community could be reassured. Jesus knew this was coming. Jesus prepared us for this. Jesus is still here. Throughout this chapter, Mark uses stock language from the popular genre known as apocalypse. Apocalypses, like Daniel that we also read today, often describe events of the world as being cataclysmic, wars and famines and natural disasters, and that the chaos on earth is reflected in heaven as stars fall, and there's blood in the moon, and various evil-looking portents. There is great suffering and a cosmic battle raging in heaven and on earth between good and evil, in which God finally wins. And so, apocalypses are meant to inspire hope, not terror. They use highly symbolic language to convey the idea that God has a plan, and even these terrible circumstances fit into the grand design that God is working out, slowly, inexorably, securely. Mark's community could hear from the catacombs these words of Jesus and see the events of their life put into context. And they could say, God's got it, no matter what was befalling them at that moment. There are all kinds of unthinkable possibilities, scary outcomes, things we never thought would happen. Whether it be our own personal endings and losses, the changing political or religious landscape, or the wars, violence, and disasters that devastate so many lives throughout the world. There is no lack for things to be anxious about. It could cause one to want to circle the wagons, protect yourself, and fight for your own. But is that what we are called to do? What do we do as people of faith when we face the unthinkable? Jesus has several words of instruction in our gospel lesson today. First of all, he says, do not be alarmed. Jesus knew that his suffering and that his disciples would also suffer. He knew that both were coming. But he also recognized that it was part of a much bigger picture. Likewise, God has not abandoned God's people or the world today. And so, when we see endings among us, when we look at what seemed unthinkable, we can trust that in the biggest picture, God is still working out ultimate victory, even when all may seem lost. Therefore, we do not need to cower in fear. Jesus also says, do not be led astray. Actually, that's my paraphrase. This is what he says. Beware that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name and say, I am he. What Jesus is ultimately getting at here is where our ultimate allegiances lie. We in the 21st century don't have many self-proclaimed religious messiahs, but we do have people and pundits who will try to sell us on their product or their politics as the key to life that will fix everything. We as Christians, however, know that Jesus is our way, our truth, and our life, and we follow his example of love and service. In times of trouble, Jesus did not turn his back on people in need. He did not seek power for his own advantage, but humbled himself as a servant and gave his life that others might live. Whatever our passion or our politics, we put our faith in Christ to save us, and we work for the good of all people as Jesus did. I think it's important in this case, then, to add 2 more verses to the reading that we did for today. Melanie helpfully put them on one of our slides so that we could look at them together today without thumbing through the Pew Bible. Mark 13, 9 and 10, Jesus goes on to say this: "As for yourselves, beware. They will hand you over to councils, and you will be beaten in synagogues. You will stand before governors and kings because of me as a testimony to them. And the good news must first be proclaimed to all nations." I think it's important to add these two verses because Jesus did not intend for us to be victims of our own circumstances. To be sure, Jesus was describing times of great suffering and evil. But those circumstances are meant to shape Jesus' disciples into being servants with the holy calling to speak the truth, to testify. In the sufferings we bear personally, we gain compassion and understanding that then later on we can share with others in similar circumstances. When we come face to face with what is wrong in the world, we are presented with an opportunity to stand up for what is right. Following Jesus' values of love, mercy, and justice. It's important every day. But I couldn't help notice the news reports yesterday about a group of neo-Nazis who marched down High Street in Columbus, my hometown. They marched under the swastika and wore masks, and they yelled racist slurs against people of color and Jews. As Christians, we must speak out with Governor DeWine to denounce this kind of hatred and admiration for a regime that murdered 6 million Jews, ethnic Poles, people with disabilities, and gay men. There is no place for this kind of bigotry or evil in our state or our communities, and we must not stand by idly when our brothers and sisters are targeted. Jesus said this is the beginning of the birth pangs. No matter how dire the situation seems, personally, societally, communally, no matter if it seems the end of the world is imminent, whatever unthinkable things might be happening, Jesus identified for his believers in his day, for Mark's believer in their day, and for believers today, that the seeds of something new resides in the endings of what you see around you. Historically, this was true in the ashes of the destroyed temple. The seeds of 2 new world religions grew out of the end of that temple practice, Christianity and modern Judaism. They thought 70 AD was going to destroy them, and instead, billions of people around the world today are the inheritors of the faith that was born in the rubble of that temple. Jesus proclaimed that whenever the end of the world comes, and he cautioned his people to think it might be imminent or never, he wanted us to make ourselves ready as best we could. Whenever the end of the world comes, he wanted his people to be assured of God's unending action that will come to fruition on the last day. And so in this passage, when Jesus is preparing his followers, and as we read it centuries later in new circumstances, we receive the same assurance that Jesus was communicating originally. That God's judgment, that the events around us, that what happens seemingly good or for ill is all a part of the good that God intends for the entire world. It is a birth, Jesus says. It is a new beginning. All of our littler endings are the same as the ultimate ending, where God brings the final act of history to a close in Jesus. And so, though being a disciple of Jesus does entail pain and sometimes danger, it also presents opportunities to make way for new life, new building, new good news. Ultimately, Jesus invites his disciples of every generation to reframe their experience in that lens of hope. That God is in the midst of the struggle of God's people, and yours and mine and people all around the world. The good news must first be preached to all nations, Jesus said. That is our job, to be people who proclaim good news, the good news of Jesus for all. That means that we have some personal and communal reflection to do. Let us ask ourselves things like, what opportunities to share good news have you found in the midst of your suffering? How is God calling you to follow Christ? Where can we as a community testify to Christ's values of love, mercy, and justice? Where are people dying for good news? What can we help them reframe with love and hope? Mark's gospel was written with hindsight, and as such, it offered reassurance to Mark's first hearers and to us that even though circumstances may seem terrible, and we do face sometimes terrible circumstances, that God is working. God is active among God's people. Whatever endings we face, our Christian response is this: to hope in God and to be people of hope. To live hope through acts of courage, love, and mercy, as Jesus did. Amen.